Everyone, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founding director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to be with you today for our reading of the virtual reading group, Life of the Mind. We are uh, starting chapter 3 of book 1. Book 1, Thinking, chapter 3, What Makes Us Think. That's an achievement. So we've gone through 2 chapters. Chapter 1 on appearance. Uh, and again, in appearance, we're really concerned with this question that Arendt takes very seriously. That whereas for most of the history of philosophy, being is held to be above appearance. For her, that's just not the case. Um, Appearing actually is prior, or they coincide at the very least. In this world, she says, into which we appear from nowhere and from which we disappear into a nowhere, being and appearing coincide. Um, and so she takes that quite seriously, and this leads us to the question that for her there must be the fact that there is uh, an ego, a thinking ego, which doesn't appear, which withdraws from the world, is in some sense a deception or a fallacy. But she says it could be a fallacy in the sense that it's a dogmatic fallacy, that it sort of leads us astray, or it could be what she calls an authentic fallacy. And that's what, in many ways, that first chapter on being an appearance is about, how the thinking ego, even though it's a fallacy, even though there's not this purely abstract thinking ego, we're always connected to a body, always connected to a world. Um, uh, there's something meaningful in the thinking ego that we have to take seriously. And that's what chapter 1 is about. Chapter 2 says, okay, let's say there is this thinking ego, and it's an authentic fallacy. What does it do? Right? What does it do out there thinking, separate from our body and our reality? Um, and she says, well, it thinking is one of these mental experiences that we distinguish ourselves from. There are others, and she's going to talk about willing and judging, or in this book, or has intentions to, and doesn't really get to judging, but there are hints of it. And even though the two world theory is a fallacy, she says, since we're always in the world of appearances, um, this thinking ego is authentic because it engages in mental activities that are meaningful, right? It thinks things like justice and truth and courage, which we don't see as things in the world. Now we can um, find examples of them, but we never see justice in the sense that you see a book. Uh, and so she says, um, the mental activities in the world of appearances, um, are meaningful. And of course, the driving inquiry of this whole book on thinking is that thinking is not driven by a quest for truth, but by a quest for meaning. Um, and in this sense, um, thinking is about meaning free from the constraints of reality. That's so important in chapter 2, which we just finished last week. If thinking is free from reality and is not about truth, but it's about meaning, um, it can only be at home in the world of appearances, insofar as in some way the thinking ego, as an authentic semblance, is still tied to the world of appearance. If it's just purely floating out there in nowhere's land, right? Then, it doesn't have much meaningful, authentic to say. And so, um, the sort of core chapters of core sections of chapter 2 are these last two sections on metaphor, language and metaphor and on the ineffable, in which she makes this argument, um, that even though thinking seems free from reality, free from common sense, anti-life, anti-vital, seems to take on the color of death, and that the thinker, who looks up at the stars and walks into the well and drops like Thales does, seems to be a fool or ridiculous. Um, there is a way in which even the thinker, insofar as they think in language, is connected to the world. Because even to think about things like justice or courage or hope, right, which one doesn't see in the world, we have to use metaphors to do so. Um, and so these metaphors are like the bridge through language that ties us back to the world. And and so she wants to say, yes, thinking, even though it's radically free in some sense, and even though it's a semblance, and even though it's free from reality, nevertheless is tied to the world and the world of appearances. Okay, so that's where sort of chapter 2 begins to end, and then she then ends it with this reflection on, okay, well, what is a metaphor for thinking? If metaphors are what tie us to the world, and we're interested in this question of thinking, what is thinking? And she says, well, the only metaphor for thinking that we sort of have is that thinking is like the breath of life. Now, obviously, thinking is not the breath of life. It's something completely different. And if you stop thinking, you're still alive. But what she says is that insofar as a body without breath is dead, so is, in some sense, a mind without thinking, right? That's the metaphor or the analogy, or that you want to do it. Um, uh, the analogy is that thinking turns in a circle, and the activity of thinking is like life itself. You can't you can't be a living thinker and not think. Um, and so that's the metaphorical idea of thinking. Um, and this raises the question of, well, okay, um, why do we think? And she says, well, you know, Wittgenstein asks this question and says, we could say we think for a whole host of reasons, right? Thinking works, it leads to advantages. Um, and sometimes it does, but she says sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes thinking leads us into blind alleys, and sometimes thinking leads us to nothing advantageous, but we still think. I mean, we've all been there, right? Lost in thought. Nothing comes of it. In fact, sometimes you feel like you wasted your time. Um, but somehow we still think. And she says, so if we're going to understand thinking first as this um, invisible thing that leaves the world of appearances, this ego, and secondly, as tied back to the world through metaphor and language, we're going to have to not focus on the question of why we think, what's the goal of it, what its use is for. We need to suppress that question and just look at what she calls uh, the facts of what people think about. And that she calls the question of what makes us think. Um, now, it's obviously a very similar thing to why we think, but it's the point for her is it's not an internal goal or internal drive to end up with some end. It's not a means end thinking. What makes us think is not some end to achieve. It's what calls us to think, right? Um, and there's going to be a number of answers in this chapter, right? And the chapter is broken into a few different sections. Uh, one answer is going to be given by Plato. We think because of the of a of a wondrous affirmation of meaning and unity. In a sense, we think because there are moments in which we're struck by wonder at the wholeness of the world, the meaningfulness of the world, and that um, just calls us to think. Not because we'll achieve it or because it's going to bring us benefits, uh, but because we're struck by this and we think it. The Romans are going to reject that answer, she's going to say, and says that what makes us think is actually the inability to find meaning and unity, unhappiness and division. And this leads us to think. And Socrates is going to say that we think out of an eros or a love for life, out of the sense that thinking is the highest state of being alive. And that it's a bit of a preview, but I think it's helpful for us to understand where things are going in this chapter on what makes us think in order to make any sense of it. Okay, so we read today sections 14 and 15. Section 14 is called the Pre-philosophic Assumptions of Greek Philosophers. Now, again, there's no why we think here in the sense that it achieves something for us. Um, what she's interested in chapter 14 is showing how in Greek life, prior to the emergence of something like philosophy, um, uh, the Greeks had the experience of human life as one of mortality, that we will die, and that this was a problem for the Greeks because, well, what's the meaning of life if we're just here to die, right? And they don't have a Christian idea that, we're going to heaven or anything like that. And so it seems like life would be fairly worthless. And so uh for Greeks, these pre-philosophical Greeks, their sort of response to the real problem of mortality was that some things like poetry could immortalize humanity. So could politics, by the way. So in another book of hers, The Human Condition, Arendt is concerned with, says that the Greek answer to the problem of action, namely in this case, the problem that action is constant and never actually finishes and doesn't achieve what it set out to do in its own because it's just action and it's only made by the storytellers. That the Greek solution to the problem of sort of the indeterminateness of action is politics, right? Because politics creates a polis, a space where people who act are seen and heard, and we tell stories about them and we build a culture or a civilization. And in doing so, people who act are remembered and they become sort of immortal, right? Not sort of, they become immortalized. And some people more than others, for sure. But um this action in a polis immortalizes. Um, in in there's another way that Greeks came to find um, a way to immortalize humans, and that's poetry. And the example here, of course, is Homer as the great example, insofar as Homer tells the stories of Greeks, of Odysseus or Achilles or Hector and others, and in telling the story, um, immortalizes them and allows them to achieve this kind of immortality, very much solving the problem of the meaninglessness of human life. Um, for the Greeks, the pre-philosophic Greeks, right? The poets don't just repeat what happened, the action, but they tell a story. They set it straight. They set it right. And so she says these pre-philosophic Greeks address this problem of meaninglessness by elevating the spectator over the doer. That truth is seen in the art and the seeing and the telling, um, not in the doing. And The great illustration of this is Homer's description of Odysseus in the Odyssey, when he is brought to a banquet at the court of the Phaeacians, and the king, who doesn't know who Odysseus is, he's hidden his identity, has a singer, a bard, sing Odysseus's tale. And hearing the misery of his tale, Odysseus cries, and he had never cried before. And Arendt says this is the illustration, the Homeric illustration of the superiority of artistry over action, that the artist makes the story meaningful, and only through the artistic singing and telling does the story come to have a kind of truth to it, a full meaning to it. Nobody and nothing exists without a spectator, right? This goes back to the beginning of the book. Um, if a tree falls in the forests and no one hears it, does it make a sound, right? Well, Arendt says no, because if there's no one there to see it or hear it, there's no tree, right? Sound, even the tree, only exist in a world of appearance. They don't exist on their own. Um, and uh, and so who becomes immortal, right? Or who makes someone immortal? Is it the doer or the teller, right? And she here says, well, Pericles is the person who articulates the action for the doer, right? He says that the greatness in his funeral oration, he says the greatness of Athens is in her deeds, and in her warlike deeds, she leaves monuments, imperishable monuments behind her, right? Battles won, cities killed, etc. But but Arendt says that philosophy breaks with Pericles insofar as it says that immortality is not in deeds, but in the philosophical dwelling in the world of ideas, as Plato put it. Um, uh, why does philosophy do that? Well, philosophy finds the world of deeds and the world of human actions um, inconvenient, right? One answer is, if we have to worry about stories and which stories are told, well, that depends on not only bards like Homer, but individual citizens, doxa, meaning, and they can be wrong. They can kill Socrates, and they can say Socrates was a traitor and Socrates was corrupting the youth. And so Plato says, to some degree, we need to move beyond the many to the one. And the one is the philosopher who exists in proximity to the ideas. And so the thinker contemplates the whole outside the world, gives meaning to the whole, just like the storyteller does. Um, and so we have this motion that she's talking about, that for the gods and immortals of the pre-philosophic Greeks are replaced by the philosophic Greeks with this idea of being. Now, and similarly, religion is replaced by philosophy. Now, being, right? To ontos in Greek, sein in German, um, is what philosophy comes to be about. And so Arendt says the concord between being and philosophy is that being, very much in the sense that Plato talks about it in the world of ideas, what makes the ideas truer than the things in the world? It's that they are enduring forever. The ideas don't degrade. The idea of the book, it does, even if the book disappears, you still have the idea of the book. The idea of justice, we don't know what that is. The idea of a circle, you never see a real circle, but the ideas are permanent and fixed. And so the ideas and being live in the eternal. And that's why philosophy can live in solitude without their fellow man. And even without poets to tell the story, they can depend on no one but themselves. And so by using our mind, our intellect to think being, the philosopher can withdraw from the perishable world and assimilate to the divine. Um, and that's the counter that Arendt is here talking about between the pre-philosophical and the philosophical Greeks. Um, in modernity, she worries, right? We lose the incentive to philosophize, that we lose what makes us think. Because for the Greeks, pre-philosophic Greeks, what made us think was a sense that uh, we we mortals uh, needed to become immortal. We wanted to love immortality, and so we thought by writing poetry or doing deeds. For the philosophical Greeks, in order to attain immortality, right? We have to dwell in the eternal. Um, uh, but for increasingly in modernity, right, we don't believe in the eternity of ideas. The end of metaphysics means that we no longer believe in this true unity. And so, what makes us think, right? And she says, for Voltaire, it becomes a kind of cheap curiosity, right? We think about truth sort of like the same way we think about a car crash. We look at it, we study it in college, and then we no longer think about it because it's just not that important. We don't really believe in it. We watch the world with a mild curiosity, and no longer do these questions drive us. And so, that's the problem that she's going to explore in the rest of this chapter. Um, the first answer that she gives to this problem of what makes us think is Plato's, right? Which she's already given us a sense of in chapter 14, but now in chapter 15, she sort of here says, here's Plato's real answer. And the answer is that what makes us think is a kind of affirming wonderment, that we are struck by wonder. The Greek word is stalmedzine. Now, I think for a lot of people who read this, and a lot of even people who, I know a lot of faculty members, colleagues, who would say, yeah, wonder. And I think the easiest way to understand this is that, well, what makes us think is that we're puzzled by the world, right? That we see, we see things happen and we say, what could be the cause of that? And we think it must be God, and we start to think about God. Or we make myths, right? That's not Arendt's answer. She says that Plato's affirming wonder doesn't come out of puzzlement. She says it comes out of an awareness of an invisible harmony of the cosmos. It comes out of a need or a feeling to glorify the unity of the world beyond the visible. We think what makes us think is a hint, a sense, a wonder that all these things happening, right, has to be part of some master plan, right? Whether it's environmental warming and environmental tragedy, or AI and what that might do to humanity, or the election of Donald Trump in the United States, or Orban, or maybe the Alternative for Deutschland soon in Germany, or the National Front in France, the rise of populism, AI, global warming, all these terrible things apparently that some of us think are happening to the world. Somehow we find moments of invisible harmony, of cosmos, of the glory and unity of the world, that there's a non-visible harmony or nature or totality of things. And this wonder leads us to think in words that can never express but at hint at this harmony. Heidegger, who writes a lot about this, calls it a winken, to wink or to indicate the harmony. Um, and this wonder is at the wholeness, the sounding together of opposites, the meaning of evil and horror, of all the particulars in the world taken together somehow fit and make sense. Um, and so Plato thinks, she says, out of this sense of wonder at the harmony of the world. She says that it's hard to see that today, hard to feel that today. One of the last people to feel it was the poet Coleridge, English poet, romantic English poet Coleridge, who she says, even though he's a little too subjective because he's modern, gets at least part of it, where he says, that the love of existence drives us, at the mystery, the ineffable, the sense that there's a greater than individual whole. And she quotes a long passage from his poem, The Friend 3. Um, uh, and the question, she says, that emerges suddenly amongst modern thinkers, starting with the German 17th, 18th century thinker Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, is why is there something and not nothing, right? Suddenly, when we ask and we think about the whole and the unity, we start to say, why is there something? Why is there a whole? Why does it all make sense? And is it not just painful nothingness? And Leibniz, the first thinker to frame this question explicitly, has an answer, right? It's a logical answer. He says there is nothing that doesn't have a reason. He offers the greatest philosophical principle, right? Nihil est sine ratione, the principle of sufficient reason. Nothing exists without a reason. And so Leibniz says, since everything must have a reason, Hitler and global warming and AI and everything must have a reason. And you can trace it back, but no physical reason can be the reason, because then there would be a reason for that. And you can go back and back and back and back. You'll never get there. And so he says there must be a non-sensible, non-physical reason. Call it God. Aristotle actually makes a similar point many years before, where he says that there's a first mover. There has to be an unmoved mover. Um, and so Leibniz answers this philosophical shock of why is there something rather than nothing with his answer, God. Kant, who follows Leibniz, was the first philosopher who started to see the danger in this question. I mean, Leibniz probably saw the danger of it, but he knew the answer, God. Kant doesn't believe that you can just say God. And so he says, well, we need a philosopher's God. We need to assume that there's an answer to it, even if we can't know it. But in seeing that we don't know that there's a unity, but we just have to assume it, Kant already um, allows the sheer despair that arises out of thinking to pop out and to rear its head in the history of philosophy. He pushes it back in, right? And he says, go away, despair. I believe the world is rational, even though I can't prove it. And as a result, we assume and we act as if, Kant says, the world has meaning and is rational, even though we can't prove it. But that genie has now been let out of the bottle. And every philosopher post Kant has to deal with it. So Schelling comes out and says, oh my God, we can't live with this doubt, this despair. And so we need what he called an absolute affirmation um, of being. Hegel says that the entire history of the world is the history of being, which negates itself, but always sublates that negation and returns to a new order, and that there's a fundamental reconciliation, a Versöhnung, a reconciliation of spirit or thought with reality, and that therefore the whole world remains rational. Nietzsche, who is more Kantian in the sense that he lets the genie back out, says that we have to, in some sense, simply will for there to be a kind of meaning, an amor fati, a love of fate. We have to embrace our fate, and what he calls the eternal recurrence of the same, the Wiederkehrung des Gleiches, is this idea that we have to will that the world as it is, with all the evil and terrible things that have happened in it, would happen exactly the same way again. We have to affirm the world as it is. Otherwise, we're stuck in this belief that nothing makes sense. And if that's where we're at, what's the point? Then you come to someone like Sartre, who Arendt doesn't usually talk about and is not a huge fan of, but she thinks his book Nausea is his best book because what Sartre recognizes in Nausea is that if there is no reason that there is something rather than nothing, and if this is the basic metaphysical question, then we are left with the fact that there really is just nothing. And if we lose the admiration and the glory of the world, we lose the faith in the unity and the wholeness and the greatness, and all that we have, right, is the factual nakedness of people going about their meaningless lives for no reason, um, and a feeling that that we live in a veritable abyss, and we can't endure it. We vomit at life. We throw up, and this is Sartre's, you know, answer. Uh, and Arendt thinks that that is a real problem. Uh, she says that this perplexity that we're left in, that we can't think being without nothingness, that once that you can, that Plato and all philosophers from Plato really until Kant thought being without nothingness. They assumed fundamentally that being was accessible to the thinker, that there was a unity out there. Kant is the first philosopher who says it's not there. We can't get it, but we have to act as if it's there. And then every philosopher post Kant is trying to put it back in the bottle. But this perplexity, she says, is real, and it dominates the modern world. And she says there's only two ways out of the perplexity. One is simply logical, that we affirm being. We go back to, Plato or even Kant in that way, or Hegel with reconciliation, or Schelling with affirmation. And she says, unfortunately, the problem is that that doesn't work. If someone doesn't feel that there is a truth out there, they don't see the hints, telling them that there's a truth out there isn't going to work. And that's what so much of um, you know, the perplexity of college philosophy classes are. Some teacher getting up there and saying there's a truth, and the kids saying, really? Um, and so, trying to tell people there's the truth is not usually going to work. The other answer, which really begins with Heidegger, um, is this idea that there's an existential affirmation, um, a loving of the world, not as a logical affirmation, but as an experience. And Heidegger pursues it through this idea of thinking and thinking, thinking and thinking, and how they're related, and that thinking carries with it a thinking, a love of the world. And this brings us closer to Plato, Arendt says, and yet it still leaves us, in a sense, with the same problems that Plato left us with, which is if you don't have this experience of thinking and thinking, if you don't have this experience of seeing the ideas, of feeling the hints of the unity, it's very hard to resist the inverse, right? Which is that thinking leads not to unity, but to nothingness. the very idea of amor mundi, right? One of the core ideas in Arendt's work of reconciliation, of a love of the world. Is Arendt's grappling with this question? That is sketched here in section 15. Plato's answer, right, to the question of what makes us think, are these hints of the unity? She's simply telling us that we should be prepared to understand that this problem has become a lot more complicated post Kant and post what she calls or is called the death of metaphysics. Um, and we have to pursue it there. In the rest of this section, right? Chapter, we're going to talk about the Roman solution and the Socratic solution. And even though we're not going to get into modernity, this two-in-one of the Socratic solution, right? This idea that I mentioned that we think out of a kind of um, uh, deep sense of that thinking is the highest state of being alive is going to be her way of unpacking this Heideggerian existential uh, response to the perplexity of how thinking often leads not to unity but to nothingness. Okay, these are really rich chapters. I should also I just want to point out before I actually end that there's some extraordinary discussions of joy in at the end of chapter 14, where she talks about Lucretius and others and their approach to joy. In the critical edition, it's on page 133 to 134. And and since the conference at the Hannah Arendt Center next this year in 5 months is on joy, I just thought I'd point out one or two things she says here, right? Which is that um, uh, Lucretius says what joy it is when out of the sea, when out at sea the storm winds are lashing the waters, to gaze from the shore at the heavy stress some other man is enduring, right? There's a joy Lucretius finds in seeing other people suffering, um, because it tells us that we're free from troubles. Um, and this, she says, is the philosophical relevance of spectatorship. Or here, the philosophical relevance of spectatorship is lost, right? Joy is now turned into this sort of we're free from your troubles. And what is lost is the joy of transcendence, the joy of this feeling or hint at the unity and the wholeness. And it's that loss of joy that um, uh, uh, inflicts or impacts so much modern philosophy. So one of the reasons that joy is an interesting conference to have, both at this time, but also in relation to Arendt, is that for her, what makes us think is joy. It's the experience of thinking and being alive, and without joy, we're thrown back on a world without meaning, and in such a world, we are open to movements and political movements that will provide meaning in a way that is potentially super dangerous. So I think joy is an essential concept in Arendt's thought, and uh, and one that we will be talking about at our conference in October. Okay, I know that was a lot. I talked for a little longer than usual, but I think these are very complicated and rich chapters, so I hope that was okay. Uh, uh, I've gotten some questions, or I got a suggestion that I pay more attention to the chat. I would love to. It's just very hard for me to talk at the same time and also uh read the chat. I just can't multitask like that. Maybe younger people can, but I can't. If there are questions in the chat that people think would be worthwhile me being alert to, please let me know. Raise your hand and let me know. I just can't do two things at once. I apologize for that. So uh I do believe that there's great stuff going on in the chat. When I do look at it, it looks that way. So just let me know if there's things I should talk about. Otherwise, if you want to participate, otherwise go down to the React button, click on React and hit raise hand, and I will recognize you. John, you're up first.
Okay, I'm just responding to what you said about joy and Lucretius, and to continue on the following paragraph after the reference to Lucretius on the original edition, it's page 140, where she says, "It was left to Voltaire to draw conclusions from Lucretius' proposition. According to him, the desire to see is nothing but cheap curiosity." Um, That is to say, Lucretius was feeling joy because he was able to um, behold the suffering of the people on the sea uh, and see it kind of aesthetically, but because he was separated from it, it didn't bother him. It was a kind of a joy, which is a metaphor for the ivory tower, the philosopher who disengages from the world that we all live in. And Arendt's comment is if Lucretius is right and man's passion for seeing spectacles is due solely to his sense of safety, then the sheer lust for seeing can be ascribed only to an immature, irrational drive that endangers our very existence. That is, Lucretius' comment is utterly apolitical.
Yeah.
Doesn't realize that we are plural, that we're a plurality, and that we have to live together. So I just wanted to point that out. It bothered me that that his sense of joy seems to me to be a very negative sense of joy.
Well, yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, all of these things, all these discussions she has on page 133, or you said 140, um, are indications of the problem, right? Of the loss of uh a sense of wonder, and thus a loss of sense of joy. Lucretius, she also talks about the Christian approach, as well as Voltaire and others. And um, insofar as we lose a connection to what makes us think as a hint at a unity, um, we we we're left with a kind of cheap curiosity, as she puts it for Voltaire, or with Lucretius, um, as you said, a completely apolitical retreat into a kind of aesthetic spectatorship, um, which is not what she thinks Plato and the Greeks were about. So you're absolutely right. Thank you. Jason.
I just had a quick note. For me, this is such a amazing indictment here to Western thought. I was raised in the Eastern tradition, and the the general push is to acknowledge this emptiness and go and make that the ground on works. And so for me, it's just such an interesting thing to actually see the full um, literature review of the Casa Sui project that is just, that is fundamental. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, we don't like the idea that, nothing exists. And so to find that there is um, just this opportunity to look at where this joy arises from might in fact be transcending our agendas, getting beyond our hopes and fears. And that when you actually accept that fundamental emptiness as something we all actually have to deal with, and that becomes the common ground, and we can then build from that. Everyone has got hopes and fears, And it actually doesn't matter to any of us when at the end of the day we all die. Nobody gets out, alive. And so therefore we can have compassion for one another that can be at the ground for building that joy.
Yeah. You know, the she thinks that there are certainly resources within the Western tradition to develop that alternative idea, and one of them is Socrates, who's going to play a major role in her thought. And that will be what the last two chapters of um last two sections of this chapter are about. Um, there is a real question, though, right? To what extent we can build a human philosophy or human thought on nothingness, right? I mean, if I understood you to say, Jason, that you that the East, at least as your reading of the Eastern tradition that you were brought up in, is to begin with nothingness. Um, which you could see as an antidote to the Western tradition beginning with being and unity. Um, uh, I don't think she wants to begin with nothingness, and I think she thinks that there's a real, I mean, that's why I think she talks so much about Sartre and others. I think that to really begin with nothingness, um, it's hard to build on that. I mean, this is the existential question of our age, right? If you fundamentally believe that there's nothing, that it's all a sham, uh, and that really there's nothing except that we are born, we eat, we shit, we get old, we lose our memory, and we die. It's hard to go on. Um, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to go on if, I there are ways to go on, right? One is, I don't know if this is, well, one is sort of immature Nietzschean view, right? Which is that there is no truth. All there is power. And the purpose of life is simply to win and to have your interests come out first. Um, this view, which I don't think was Nietzsche's view, but I think it's a view that many ascribe to Nietzsche because they find it to be their view and they want some intellectual um, uh, support for it. Uh, which is simply that since it nothing, there is no truth, there is no meaning, and therefore I might as well end up with the most toys, right? Whoever dies with the most toys wins, and that life is just about winning. This might be considered to be a in many ways the Trumpian mantra, right? Uh, yeah, I think if you believe in that and believe that winning, another way of put this is go back to Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, might makes right. If you believe that winning is what in the end makes you and life meaningful, um, there is something to fight for. And I think one of the attractions of a lot of this manliness winning philosophy that we're seeing in around the world, not just in the United States, um, comes from a sense that that's what gives people purpose and meaning. That life is about a struggle, and if the government gives you too much support, and if there's too many, safe spaces and too much coddling of people, um, we don't actually live a meaningful human life, which is to fight and to win and to struggle. And this is, there's a tradition of such vitalist philosophy, largely coming out of existentialism, Sartre, and post Nietzsche thought. And it has an intellectual tradition to it, not and so one can move in that direction. Uh, and if you really do believe that there is nothing, that may be the only direction you can move in to save you. I teach a course which I'll be teaching again next semester. Um, it's officially called Truth in Politics, but I really call it Truth and Power. And the course is actually a reading of a one-page text by Nietzsche called "How the True World Became a Fable," which shows how we lost. It starts with Plato and the idea that truth was knowable to reason, and then to Augustine and the Christians, truth is knowable to those who believe. And then it gets to Kant and says, well, no, truth is no longer knowable, but it still matters. And then we get to the utilitarians and the positivists, Comte and Mill, and we show how for them truth is simply useful. And then we get to the nihilists who say there is no truth, and once there's no truth, there's also no, untruth. It's all just about power or will. And and once you believe that, the question is, well, what do we do? Do we simply just say it's all about power and lie and cheat in order to win? Right? That's one view of politics today. Stop talking about justice or stop talking about, rule of law. These are just interests. And if it's in your interest to keep justice, then keep justice. And if it's not in your interest to justice, then don't. These are not truths. These are just, battles to be fought. And, you know, it's fascinating for me to see how usually half the class splits on each side. One class says we can't give up on truth, and the other half says, look, truth is a non thing. It's all will anyway. We should fight for our side. And I think in many ways, that's what Arendt's writing about here. All right, Eric.
Thanks, Roger. I wanted to ask about this, the wonder-struck beholding that is I guess, the basis for thought. And I'm working from the older McCarthy text. So at the bottom of 142, she's talking about in Homer how this wonder is reserved for when the gods visit humans, right? And the responding wonder, therefore, is not something men can summon up by themselves. So I'm interested here in the tension between this idea that we could begin thinking and end thinking in the way that I think in the past you've noted that Arendt thinks thinking can happen, as in like we control it, versus this idea of wonder as something that has to be that we suffer rather than act, that just occurs within us. And I love that she brings in the romantics, right? Coleridge talks about mastery of this intuition of absolute existence. So how does Arendt think we can cultivate this type of wonder so that, as Wordsworth would say, like, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we can see into the life of things, or does it just happen to us? Like I go down to the river, I look at the light reflected on it. Sometimes I feel the oneness. Sometimes it's just light on water.
That's a great question, Eric. How does one cultivate what we might call thought, right? If thought, right, is for Arendt this uh uh intuition or sense of joy or wonder, and if thought is this sense of being alive, how does one teach or cultivate thinking? I take that to be Eric's question. Eric, am I wrong to ask to see that as your question?
That's correct. That's my question.
Yeah. Um, uh, you know, so I have a couple different ways to want to, it's a great question and a couple different ways I want to pursue it. One is, it makes me think of that famous footnote in Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, which some of you have heard me talk about before, where um Kant is talking about how to uh encourage in young people a sense of the moral law. And he says, I got a letter from the late Professor Sulzer, who asked me this question. And I took me a long time to figure out my answer. Unfortunately, he's now dead. But here's my answer. And what Kant says is you can't teach morality by telling people what the morals are through catechisms or logic. You can only teach it through the power of example, right? You can act morally, and insofar as you act morally when you could have acted immorally, people are struck by that, and they say, why? And they say it must be because you saw yourself as called to be a rational being, a moral person, and that puts morality in the world by the fact that you acted that way. Um, um, I think thinking is similar, right? I don't think you can teach thinking by teaching, uh, you know, what Plato or Hegel or Kant or Arendt said. But I think you can teach thinking by making Plato and Kant and Hegel and Arendt come alive for students. If you show the students what it means to think with these thinkers and how much fun it is, not just as haha, but as how it makes you feel alive and brings you joy. I think you can inculcate the love of and habit of thinking. Arendt says, in other words, what sets men wondering is something which is familiar and still usually invisible, and something which men are forced to admire, right? It's not puzzlement or surprise, she says. What we wonder at is confirmed and affirmed by admiration. And this admiration breaks out into speech. The gift of Iris, the messenger god, the rainbow, the messenger from above. This speech is praise, a glorification, not of particularly amazing appearance or of the sum total of things in the world, but of the order and harmony in which they appear. So the way you teach wonder, the way you teach thinking, is by somehow bringing someone to see for a moment, to see hints of the wonder and the beauty and the order and the glory and the harmony of the world that is invisible. Um, uh, that's the, when I said there were two answers to the perplexity, one was logical and one was existential. This is the existential answer, right? We pursue, we teach thinking, and we think by pushing ourselves into the experience of of seeing or having a hint at the glory of the world. And that happens in moments of joy and of transcendence. And that's why those moments are so important. That's why arts and the humanities are so important, right? I mean, we're living in a time in which, uh, you know, you can't get people to take arts and humanities courses at most colleges in the country. I'm very lucky to be at a college where that's an exception. But people ask, well, that's not useful. That's not thinking. That's not, gonna get me anything. And Arendt would be like, you're right, it's not gonna get you anything. Except it's gonna protect you from those moments of existential dread and horror and nausea when you realize that your pursuit of winning in the end gets you nothing either. Max.
I was thinking about some of the discussion we've been having about meaning and nothingness, and some of Arendt's engagements with Freud, who kind of took this position that the tension of life between the craving for meaning and the suspicion that there isn't any can kind of lead us into one of two traps, either one being narcissism and kind of that desire for domination of some kind on the one hand, and then the death drive on the other hand, and that in his view, the tension is irresolvable, and that the what's left is sort of this stoicism, managing the tension rather than trying to resolve it. And Arendt's complaint that the problem with that is how individualistic it is, that it doesn't allow for engagements in the world. Politics, I'm sure, would be what was on her mind. And I'm wondering if perhaps in light of that one of the ways that Arendt might respond to some of the discussions we've been having about nothingness versus meaning is returning to that dynamic of promise and forgiveness that she talks about in the human condition, meaning the promises we make are kind of our assertions against meaninglessness. But on the other hand, asking for forgiveness when we fail is kind of an acknowledgement of our inability to dominate, or our vulnerability and those sorts of things.
So I mean, those are two interesting questions. Not sure I see the connection between them, but let me answer the second one first, and then Max, you can come back and tell me how it connects to the first, if I understand it. See, Max is referring us to the two last chapters or sections of the chapter on action in the human condition, on promising and forgiveness, which deal with what she calls the perplexities of action, right? So you can see the parallel to this chapter, and that this chapter deals with the perplexity of thinking, in which thinking can lead to nothingness. And she says there's two answers to that. One is logical and one is existential. In the human condition chapter on action, she says the perplexities of action are that we don't know its outcome, can't be controlled, and therefore it can lead to all action can lead to bad things as well as good things. And so it's indeterminate. And so she says there are two responses to the perplexities of action, just like here there are two responses, the perplexity of thinking. One is promising, right? Which tries to control action by limiting what will happen as a result of it. So you promise something in the future and it's supposed to make the action predictable. And the other is forgiveness, which basically says even though you do an action, whether it's intended good or intended bad, it can lead to terrible things. And we forgive you for it because you know not what you do. And nobody can be held responsibility for all the implications of their actions because those actions are unknowable. Those implications are unknowable. And so I think there's a certain parallel, right, in here that you've identified, Max, and I hadn't thought of before, so it's really thoughtful and helpful. But I think they're very different problems. One is the problem of action, and this is the problem of thinking. Um, uh, and I'm not sure I could go much further than that. So maybe you can tell me if there's a place further you want to go or you want me to go. You're muted, Max. I'm sorry. You have to unmute yourself.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I think you kind of mostly thought your way to it. And I guess it's maybe where I'm crossing a line is in seeing the relationship between thought and action as being, permeable, dynamic, perhaps is more what I'm thinking is that the thinking about meaning, and I think we probably think in meaning, and what we think about is things that are happening in the world, what the meanings of those things are, and then trying to settle it, I suppose. And that's the tension that Freud talked about that he thinks is irresolvable, is that if we try to settle what the meaning of things happening in the world is, then that can lead us to ideologies, for example, things that explain everything, and requiring that the world, all of it, conform to that, whatever vision that is. So sort of narcissism writ large.
Yeah.
And then the opposite of that would be this kind of despair that was coming up in some of the earlier parts of our conversation today, which, the Thanatos death drive thing is that. And so for him, the answer was, this kind of stoicism that you can arrive at through psychoanalysis. And so when the thinking about those things, thinking about the possibilities of meaning of things happening to us in the world around us, and the possibility that they have no meaning, that for Arendt, what those poles, I guess, of thinking may lead us to, if we don't just want to become sort of little stoics, is to engage the world through our thought, through the dynamic of that. Essentially, that would define our approach through the dynamic of promise and forgiveness. Promise being reflecting that craving for meaning and trying to assert it against the possibility of meaningless in the world, but also engaging forgiveness and forgiving oneself, forgiving others, asking forgiveness of ourselves and others as an acknowledgement that we don't have that kind of power that the ideologies would propose to us. and that is, you know, for Freud, a reflection of narcissism.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Max. Um, so yeah, I mean, first of all, one of the premises of this book is that thinking is an activity. It's not a, and as an activity, um, uh, you know, it's different from other actions in that it doesn't appear in the world, and yet it still is an activity. And as we said, you know, it's withdraws, it's an assemblance, and yet it also is connected to the world of appearances, and so this is there is a way in which it's an activity, and yet it doesn't have the same perplexities of action or that actions do that are in the world of appearances. Um, uh, the activity of thinking, right, is not one that generally impacts the world. And as a result, it's not usually going to do evil. Uh, you know, whether I think about joy is not going to, you know, lead to climate change or genocide or something else. Um, Arendt holds out the possibility, right, that thinking can prevent evil, insofar as it stops us from going along with unthinking thoughts. Um, uh, and I think that's an important place, understanding of where action is. I don't know that I fully understand or get the connection of promising and forgiveness within thinking. But that doesn't mean it's not right. I just not sure I fully get it. I mean, I think Freud's works like The Future of an Illusion um and Civilization of Discontents are great works of thinking that raise exactly the kind of questions that Arendt is raising here, and I think she would you know, certainly value them. Where she worries about someone like Freud is this thought that we can create a science of the human brain, um, and and teach us to be, in a sense, less neurotic or less or more happy or something like that. Not to say that that's what Freud thought per se, but that's what I think she thought a lot of Freudianism was geared towards. She worried about that. Um, but I'm not sure I can say much more on it. So thank you, Max. Those are good questions. Stephen, you have a question. I just want to note that we have about 15 minutes left. Especially if there are women who have a question or anyone else, because we haven't had any yet today. So I want to encourage that. And Stephen, you're up next.
Thank you, Roger. Well, I'll be brief. In this context, I'd like to raise the question of what made Arendt as a political thinker think. Because in response to an interviewer, she said what she is trying to do is to understand. And of course, the rise of Hitler forced her to think about politics. And one thing she emphasized was rooting her thinking in experience, in distinction to the intellectuals whose thinking went on in all sorts of circles without without the kind of metaphorical connection to the world that she writes about in this book about thinking. And I just wonder if you would connect her own impetus for thinking politically with with the context of this discussion.
Um, it's a good question. You know, just give me a second here. Well, I guess I can try and put it this way. I mean, you answered your question in some way, Stephen. You said that she says that I think or I write to understand, right? What does it mean to understand? It means to comprehend what's seemingly incomprehensible, right? Individual, awful, horrific acts, but also everyday experiences, to understand them. Now, one way to understand them is to, in a Hegelian sense, to set them within um, a story that is logical and has a beginning and an end, and and reduces the particulars to simply a carrying out of some, larger universal intellectual purpose.
Mhm.
Um, uh, Arendt, thinks that that impulse um, is deeply anti-political and anti-human, insofar as she thinks that humans are not simply uh, um, you know, uh, manifestations of some larger unfolding of an intellectual idea. And so, what she says is that we have to think and understand the incomprehensibility of the human world,
Mhm.
and yet still try and say something meaningful about it. Right? This is, you know, you if you just say the incomprehensibility of the human world and therefore it means nothing, then you are left with nausea. But she thinks that the goal is to say something about it and still um build a meaningful world. So if you were to put it back in what I was saying before about this course I teach on truth and power, right? We're not going back to truth, but to simply embrace power, um, is to leave us with, I think, a different form of nausea. What Arendt's, I think, an Arendtian response is to say, look, we need to do the work of building a new truth that is not a metaphysical truth, that is not a truth that comes from ideas or reason or science or God, but is a truth that emerges from the bottom up in what we share by talking about a world that we share. That's why um, the idea of thinking, which for her is this conversation, this enlarged way of thinking, this two in one, this talking with others, assuming as many perspectives as we can, allows us to build a world that we share, which is true, not in the sense of Hegelian unfolding of a universal idea or religious or theological imposition from God, or a Platonic, seeing of some true metaphysical idea, or even a Kantian as if we were rational, whatever rational is, but actually comes from human beings talking and building something that we share step from the bottom up. Um, that I think is her point. Um, and and that's how I think she imagines things.
That's very helpful, Roger. It reminds me of a phrase that she quotes, reconciliation with reality.
Yeah,
In light of total war, genocide, she wants to be able to love the world. So
that's
she
right.
has to understand what is going on to get beyond those appalling phenomena so that she can love the world and find solidarity with others.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
Patty, you're up.
Thank you, Roger. Um, I'm standing in my recent baccalaureate shoes. And I'm so grateful for all the wisdom in this room every week. I just found so much in these two chapters that really resonated with my Buddhist practice of 40 years. And I've been accused of by professors of always finding a Buddha in whatever whatever seminar I'm in. But I really feel like that this was these chapters sort of cried out to me as a directive towards non-doctrinal thought, towards the exploration. And the title of my senior project was Wonderings and Wanderings. And I spent a lot of time sitting on the bench by Hannah's grave, wondering. And I wish I had really explored more of her, because it would have really informed my poetry. But when she talked about remembrance and how creating a lasting story it was really important to the ego-driven philosophers, I feel, and how I feel like this quest for thinking is really about opening, and and um, and that we don't, in this time, we don't have that space created on a regular basis to chop wood and carry water and just be with thought and reflect. And also she talks about experience and sharing experience, and that is also another thing that we don't do in a thoughtful manner in society now. We do it in a complaining manner or a calling out manner, and so I wonder where beyond academia is this space for the thinkers.
Thanks, Patty. And Wondering and Wandering is a great title. So well done. Yeah, I mean, I think there's always space for it, right? I mean, whether you can make a living on it is a different question. But you don't have to make a living through what's meaningful to you. You know, many of the great writers in history worked menial jobs, did their thing, and then wrote on the side. I mean, certainly someone like Borges, or Hoffman or others, they worked, as Borges said, you have to work a sort of stupid job so you don't have to use any brain power, so that when you come home at night, you can actually do your writing and thinking. But I mean, I think there's also, I mean, where are the spaces for thinking? Many of them. Talking with friends. Now, of course, talking with friends means that you trust your friends so that you can say things that they, even if they find they don't agree with or are offensive, they'll still be your friends. And that's maybe harder today than it used to be, but that's sort of one. I don't know if those of you may have heard of it, but Uday Mehta and I just recorded an interesting show on Montez Radio, which we linked to on our Amor Mundi last week, about friendship and how you talk amongst friends, and we really explored this issue there. But talking with friends, being a writer or a poet, you know, another way to do it. Being an artist, having that freedom to do it. Now, you may have to make living sometimes doing other things, but not always. But even so, um, I think as a business person, right? There's ways to be thoughtful as a business person. I don't think I don't think any of these things preclude thought if you're willing to, actually think and challenge and go against the norm and have the courage to stop and think and do things differently. I don't see any, I mean, okay, there are things like I mentioned before that Borges did, or what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs, which I think are probably preclude thought. But I think many jobs make room for thought if you just allow yourself to make room for it. I'll stop there. Thank you all. I love these chapters, so I hope you enjoyed it. We will read chapters 16 and 17 for next week. Look forward to seeing you then. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excelente, Professor Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, good to see you all. Alex, if you're still on, can you stay on, or maybe